Okay, everyone, welcome. We're glad you're here. I'm John Lilly with the Emory Alumni 60 Plus Network, and it's my great pleasure to introduce again Dr. Gary Hawk. I was reading a little bit more about Gary today, and saw that he's met both the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, among others. His tenure at Emory has been compared to Dooley's, and we're glad that he's alive and we have him here. So Gary's going to talk a little bit today about the history of the Carlos. Gary, thank you for coming again, and we're pleased to have you here.
Uh, Thank you, John. Yes, I don't think I'm quite ready to be in one of those cases in the Carlos Museum, but maybe one of these days, who knows? Thank you once again for the invitation to speak to this group, and thanks to all of you who are out there somewhere in Zoom land, many of whom I can see on the screen, but most of whom I do not. I appreciate your taking some time from this beautiful spring afternoon to come and join us as we reflect about the history of the Carlos Museum. This is a talk that I gave initially in the winter, actually February of, it was February of 2019, when the Carlos Museum was celebrating its centennial. But the history of the museum, of course, actually goes back well before 1919, which was the year being celebrated in 2019. And so I want to share with you some of the more interesting images, and I hope the more interesting stories along the way in talking about the development of the museum as we know it today. A number of you, before we started recording, were reflecting on your own experiences in visiting the museum at its various locations around the campus. And I want to have time at the end of my talk, it's just about 40 minutes long, to have opportunity for you to ask any questions or perhaps pose your own comments and reflections about your experiences with the museum. So I'm going to share my screen, which is always a fun moment in these presentations, and hope that you can see the slide there. Somebody, Kevin, can you give me a thumbs up if it looks good? Great. Okay, well, as I said, the museum was celebrating its centennial in 2019. So let's go back. It was 1919, and the trustees of Emory College were preparing to move their small but flourishing school from its cradle in Oxford, Georgia, to the big bustling city of Atlanta, where the college would become the School of Liberal Arts for the new Emory University, which had just been chartered in 1915 and was beginning life in the suburb of Druid Hills. Well, that year, 1919, would bring the move not only of Emory College, but also of the collection of odds and ends that the college called a museum. And Chancellor Warren Candler, perhaps seeking to preserve this eclectic collection from an uncertain fate while the university was taking shape, Chancellor Candler asked the trustees formally to establish the Emory University Museum. He said that its aim would be, and I'm quoting here, to display the ethnic, biological, geological, archaeological, and historical artifacts of human culture. And so 100 plus years later, here we are. I think of the museum's biography as having 7 chapters, sort of like the days of creation. These 7 chapters include one about ancestry. Many life stories go back to the ancestors of their subjects. A biography of Winston Churchill has to say something about his prominent parents, Lord and Lady Randolph Churchill, just as a biography of Lincoln has to climb up out of the unpromising bleakness of his early years. And so it is with the museum at Emory. The origins of the museum echo the modest circumstances of Lincoln's youth and some of the glitter and grandeur of Churchill's maturity. And so first, some notes about the museum's antecedents. The first history of Emory was published in 1936 for the centennial of Emory College. The author was an alumnus named Henry Morton Bullock. And Bullock dates the first stirrings of the museum to 1839, just 3 years after Emory College was chartered, and 1 year after the campus at Oxford opened. In 1839, the college purchased from a Dr. I.J. Cohen a mineral cabinet that contained a collection of 500 gems. And by the opening volleys of the Civil War in 1861, that collection had grown in number to more than 20,000 rocks of various shapes, sizes, and types. Now, I think of this rock collection as maybe the Neanderthal ancestor or the caveman ancestor of the sleek and cerebral Homo sapiens that is the current museum. But in at least one important way, this mineral collection resonated with the later mission of the Emory Museum, because the purpose of the mineral collection was not simply for people to view a lot of pretty things. It was a tool for teaching. And today's professors of art history, classics, religion, Middle Eastern studies, and other departments who send their students to the museum share the wish of their forebears for students to learn from the hard artifacts in their three-dimensional reality. Well, unfortunately, the Civil War wrought havoc on the Oxford campus, as it did in many places, and Emory closed for the duration of the war. And when the college reopened in January of 1866, that mineral collection, along with other valuables like the endowment and books and equipment, had vanished. It took President Atticus Haygood to sow the seeds for a new museum. In 1876, he commissioned John Fletcher Bonnell, a professor of natural science, to write to scientific gentlemen, as he put it, in all parts of the country, with an eye toward exchanging mineral species and increasing Oxford's or Emory's own collection. And for the historian Henry Bullock, this new mineral collection marks really the beginning of the Emory Museum, which would live in various places on the Oxford campus for the next 40 years. Here you see it. I think the location in this photograph is what was then called Science Hall, today called Humanities Hall. But the collection was housed also in Seeney Hall and various other places over the years. Well, through the next 2 decades, the museum gained new dimensions, shall we say. An 1889 Emory graduate and a Methodist missionary named William Patillo Turner sent his alma mater a trunk full of Japanese costumes and trinkets and antiques. And this became the nucleus of an Asian collection, which soon grew to include Thai pottery, a Korean wine pot, a brick from the Great Wall of China, Japanese samurai armor, and a Tibetan prayer wheel. So the museum that had begun with a geological focus now seemed to have a mission to exhibit the varieties of human experience. The museum grew again in 1911 when Bishop Warren Candler, who had served as president of Emory for 10 years, purchased a collection of Wesleyana that included some of the first Methodist hymnals, correspondence of the Wesley family, and odd items like Bishop Francis Asbury's razor. In that same year, a flock of birds alighted at the museum as the Reverend William LaPrade gave his alma mater a collection of stuffed Georgia birds. So by the end of the first chapter of the museum's existence, Emory had collected an assortment of objects that made the word museum sort of a term of aspiration as much as description. It was really an omnium gatherum, a term that was used for an assortment of many things. But all of them were intended to help Emory students see firsthand the wonders of nature and the curiosities of human culture that they learned about in their classes. It would require the courage and imagination of a professor of the Hebrew Bible for the museum to take its first step toward eminence. So the second chapter of this museum biography begins when the museum moved with Emory College to Atlanta. And to give you a sense of that move, consider this. The biology department of Emory College in 1919 loaded up all of its equipment in Professor Rhodes's automobile for the 40-mile drive along the unpaved Covington Highway. So we can only imagine how the university carted the birds and beetles and boulders of the museum to their new place in the theology building, which had opened in 1916 on the Druid Hills campus. That building is now called Convocation Hall. But at that time, it was the academic home of a professor who wrote the first pages of the next chapter of this history. The front page of the Atlanta Journal for February 11th, 1923, carried an article written by the future author of Gone with the Wind. Her byline on that Sunday was Peggy Mitchell, not Margaret. And the article recounted the adventures of a kind of Indiana Jones. Atlanta man just missed Tutankhamun, the headline proclaimed. And indeed, William A. Shelton, one of the first faculty members in Emory's Candler School of Theology, had gone in 1920 to what was then called the Near East. He was invited by James Breasted, the founding director of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, and one of the preeminent archaeologists of his day. Shelton had been one of Breasted's students at the University of Chicago, and interestingly, he was the only scholar not from the University of Chicago to go along on this journey. Well, the region had newly been liberated from the Ottoman Empire after World War I, and the area was open to Western scholars for the first time in centuries. There were not many restrictions on what you could recover or export in the way of antiquities, and Breasted's team could send home crates of materials, and they did. Well, the treasures that Shelton acquired included a lipstick holder that had belonged to the grandmother of King Tut's wife. And while Shelton stood in the tomb of Ramses III, directly over Tut's as yet undiscovered tomb in 1920, he never dreamed of what lay beneath his feet. Imagine what that collection of King Tut's tomb would have done for the Emory Museum and the endowment of the university had Shelton discovered it. Nevertheless, Shelton did find something almost as valuable, and that was a seed. That seed was the materials that he shipped back to Atlanta for planting on the quadrangle. Hundreds of artifacts included Egyptian mummies and coffins, Babylonian stamps, Palestinian pots, all purchased with the help of an Atlanta cotton merchant named James Manger. Well, besides gathering all of these materials, Shelton offered a vision for the role of a museum in a university. As he put it in an interview in 1926, one of the greatest features of contact with the outside world that any university can have is a fine museum. And his notion for the museum was that he wanted it to have a $100,000 fund for purchases and an endowment of $1 million to support further archaeological expeditions. And let me just add that it would take until 2002 for the museum endowment to reach $1 million. Well, chapter 3 of this museum biography opens in 1926, 1 decade after Emory opened the new campus in Druid Hills. The university was about to launch a major fundraising campaign to raise $10 million and build out the campus program. That year, 1926, Emory also appointed the first full-time director of the museum. His name was Perry Wilbur Fattig, and he would continue as the director of the museum until his death in 1953. Fattig had taught biology and agriculture in the Midwest and elsewhere, including at the University of Florida, where he met Harvey Cox. Cox was at that time the dean of education at Florida, but in 1920, Cox was appointed president of Emory, and 6 years later, he brought his former colleague, Fattig, the natural scientist, to Emory. Well, despite the literally groundbreaking contributions of Professor Shelton and his Egyptian sojourn, the Emory Museum in the 1920s was still essentially a natural history collection. And as Fattig remarked in a radio interview in 1936, Emory then had 3,000 beetles in its museum, 250 varieties of Georgia birds, 210 species of bird eggs, and an extensive collection of moths and butterflies that Fattig himself had gathered. During his tenure, the museum also established a publication series to produce his scholarly contributions in entomology, or the study of bugs. He did concede in that 1936 interview that the most interesting exhibit is our Egyptian collection. Still, the focus was largely natural sciences. Well, for a while, Fattig kept what he called a pretty fair collection of Georgia's poisonous snakes in cages at the museum to teach visitors how to recognize them. By one account, he stopped this practice after he was almost fatally bitten by one of the copperheads. The same article called him modest and somewhat shy, and as proof of this, it noted that he only reluctantly would demonstrate his ability to stick pins in himself and through parts of his arm or leg without bleeding or apparent pain. He is not a lover of the spectacular, said the article. Well, as I said, Mr. Fattig, Dr. Fattig, served as director of the museum until he died in 1953. And at that point, some question arose whether the university really needed or could use a museum. President Goodrich White appointed a committee to study the matter and make recommendations. And when the committee completed its study in 1954, they gave a thumbs up. And at the same time, Charles Howard Candler Sr., the builder of Callanwold, the oldest son of Asa Candler, gave money to build the administration building. And he suggested that half of the first floor of that building should be set aside for the museum. As it turned out, the designated space in the administration building would be too small. And after a brief sojourn there, the collection was moved wholesale in 1957 to Bishop's Hall, a new home for the theology school that opened that year. Incidentally, of course, things always changing on the Emory campus. Bishop's Hall is now gone. But 5,000 square feet in the basement of Bishop's Hall provided adequate room for the museum for the first time. And this new lease on life meant that the museum would require another director. In one of his many significant decisions as president, Goodrich White asked the Emory College biology professor, Wolford Bales Baker, to take on that job part-time. Again, the choice of a biologist to direct the museum may seem unusual in view of today's museum, but in retrospect, given the nature of the museum then, so to speak, it made great sense. Curiously, Baker had arrived at Emory in the same year that Emory College and the museum moved to Druid Hills. After earning his MS degree from Emory in 1920 and later getting a PhD degree, he continued on the faculty until his retirement in 1961. He was especially keen about the natural resources on the campus, and he became something of a nag to the administration about preserving certain spaces and planting appropriate greenery. The Baker Woodlands behind the current museum are named in his memory. And so it was largely as a naturalist that Wolford Baker assumed the role of part-time director of the museum in 1954. And he would hold this post for another almost 30 years. Baker recommended that the museum should operate as a distributed collection. Some parts of the whole should be housed where they would be of most interest and use. And to some extent, this is what happened. Some of the geological specimens were housed in what was then called the Geology Building, today the Anthropology Building. Some of the biological exhibits were sent off to the Biology Building, what is now Tarbutton Hall. Rare books and documents went to the library's special collections, and dental and medical materials went to the buildings of those respective schools. There are a number of amusing stories from Dr. Baker's years at the museum, and one of these comes by way of Hollywood, when the famous director John Huston turned Flannery O'Connor's novel Wise Blood into a movie. Now, if you're familiar with this movie, you will recall the moment when the protagonist, Hazel Motes, wearing a hat in these photographs, Hazel Motes is dragged by his sidekick, Enoch Emory, spelled E-M-E-R-Y, into the museum of the fictional city of Talkingham. Enoch Emory cannot contain his excitement at showing Hazel a mummified, shrunken man, something that the Emory Museum never actually possessed, of course. But as these two interlopers sneak past the sleeping guard, you're treated to the best visual archive of what the Emory Museum looked like in the Sociology Building, as it was called, in the late 1970s, the building that's now called Carlos Hall. You can see the samurai armor on display at the entrance, the cramped arrangement of the display cases, the portable walls with their array of photos and labels and maps, and you get a general sense of having strolled into someone's unusually desperate garage sale. The second story from the Baker era comes from an Emory alumna named Sheremy Bundrick. Sheremy earned her BA in art history from Emory College in 1992, and then she stayed on to earn MA and PhD degrees in art history and now teaches art history at the University of South Florida. Well, here is Sheremy's story in her own words. She says, in 1981, I was in 6th grade. My dad took me to the museum to see the mummies after we saw Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I became totally obsessed with ancient Egypt. Dr. Baker was there and took us to his office where he pulled this from a desk drawer and gave it to me as a memento of the visit. I think it's a safe bet that I wanted to go to Emory because of that day. Well, this, as you can see in the photo, was 1 square inch of wrapping that Dr. Baker had snipped from one of the mummies. And in fact, the mummy was the oldest mummy in the Western Hemisphere, one of only 6 Old Kingdom mummies in museums anywhere in the world. One of those 6 is in Turin, Italy, and the other 4 are in Egypt. Ours is probably the only one that was a source of souvenirs for school kids. And finally, Here's where the deer comes into the title for this lecture. Dr. Baker kept up a steady stream of correspondence with people who thought, with good reason, that the museum would accept nearly anything of interest. For instance, in September 1968, he wrote to a Mrs. Edmund Frances Cook, related to President Goodrich Cook White, wrote to Mrs. Cook to thank her for her many gifts, including a spittoon, a rolling pin, a glove stretcher, a button box with buttons, and 29 dolls. Well, my favorite of Dr. Baker's letters is from 1973 to Jeffrey R. Geis of Decatur. Dr. Baker thanks Mr. Geis for the skull of a white-tailed deer. He writes, "I did not have a deer skull, but needed one to compare with the goat and the cow which I have on exhibit. If you have any of the leg bones of this deer, I would appreciate them very much." During his tenure, Dr. Baker struggled to raise the museum as a priority for the university. In a history that he compiled with geology professor James Lester in 1974, Baker recounted the nomadic existence of the museum after its move from Oxford, first into the theology building, then into a wing of Candler Library, then back to the basement of the old theology building during World War II, then to the wooden Annex B, some of you may remember that, then into the first floor of the administration building, and finally back to the basement of Bishop's Hall, a building which, as I said, is itself now gone. Baker's annual reports tell a story of hope and frustration. After the move to Bishop's Hall in 1957, the museum attracted over 3,000 visitors a year. By 1971, annual attendance had risen to nearly 23,000, including a great many students, especially from the classes of Boone Bowen and Emmanuel Ben-Dor. These were theology faculty members who were engaged in excavations in Israel and brought back many artifacts for the museum. And yet the lack of adequate space for storage and exhibitions continued to be a problem. So to make room, the university transferred the Fatig insect collection to the University of Georgia in 1961 and donated duplicate bird skins to the Fernbank Science Center in 1970. Hereafter, the biggest emphasis would be on archaeology and ancient history. When Jim Laney became dean of the theology school in 1969, he had ambitious plans, and he needed the 5,000 square feet of museum space in the basement of Bishop's Hall for faculty offices. Happily, in 1972, the law school moved out of its original home on the quadrangle and into Gambrell Hall. And the old law building thus presented itself as a possible new home for the museum. But there was some debate about all of this. Some administrators suggested that the collections should be put in storage until a better space could be identified. And Baker resisted this suggestion. He said the museum was the only one like it in Atlanta. And as he put it, it was listed on all of the travel guides of the major oil companies. And yet, without a clear sense of purpose and direction, the museum seemed threatened always to remain a backwater. A 1971 self-study acknowledged that the museum was like the collection in the attic of a large family that has lived in the same place for a number of generations. This report recommended that the university determine its commitment to the museum and clarify the museum's mission. Well, that clarification would come in the early 1980s. By then, Jim Laney had moved to the presidency of Emory in 1977. He later recalled that in the early 1980s, after the boon of the Woodruff gift in 1979, Emory began renovating all of the old quadrangle buildings. Henry Bowden, the retired chair of the board of trustees, told Laney that Michael Carlos, click, here we go. Michael Carlos had resources and might be interested in helping. Carlos was chair and CEO of the National Distributing Company, a wine and spirits wholesaler. And so Laney called Carlos one day in 1981 and invited him to meet. And as they talked in the president's office, Laney commented that Emory needed to renovate the old history building. And in view of Henry Bowden's historic leadership in dismantling racial segregation in private higher education in Georgia, it would be appropriate to rename the building for him. A $1 million gift would help with that renovation. Carlos thought that was interesting, but wondered what else the university needed. Well, said Laney, Emory also needed to renovate the old law building, renamed the sociology building, which now housed the museum and other departments. Probably said the university could do that renovation for $1.5 million. He pulled kind of a number out of the air, he later told me. Carlos offered his hand and he said, "You have a deal." And that was the beginning of the Carlos family's enormous generosity to the museum. Laney gives credit to Monique Seafried for calling his attention to the diamond in the rough that was then the museum. Monique had moved to Atlanta with her husband in 1977 while she was finishing her PhD in ancient art at the Sorbonne in Paris. In late 1980 or early 1981, a friend took her to the Emory Museum where Monique was stunned by the mishmash of things, truly valuable archaeological treasures next to dead starfish and snake skins and a Maytag washing machine that had cleansed the diapers of an important Atlanta politician in his infancy, purportedly the first Maytag washer in Georgia. Her immediate impression was that she would have to move back to Europe. How was such an enfeebled state of culture possible? But her husband, thankfully, persuaded her that she should stay and seek to change things at the museum rather than move away. So Monique met with President Laney to tell him what needed to be done. She said that Emory had a wonderful museum camouflaged by cast-off junk. And if Emory truly wanted to stand among the best universities, he could no longer have a laughingstock of a museum. Shortly after that meeting, Michael Carlos met with Laney to talk about a possible gift, and the moment was ripe. As a result of those meetings, the university announced that the newly renamed Emory University Museum of Art and Archaeology now would focus on those two subjects, and everything else would be dispersed. After 28 years as the part-time director of the Emory Museum, Dr. Baker retired again at the age of 89, but he would live for another 11 years to see the dedication of an entire new building for the museum. Clark Poling, professor of art history and a specialist in 20th century art, was named the director of the museum, and he set about guiding its reorganization. Fossils, rocks, minerals, all returned to Oxford College, while seashells, marine specimens, birds, insects, dental office equipment, all were packed off to the Fernbank Science Center, and reptile specimens were shipped to the Savannah Science Museum. With the gift of Michael Carlos in hand, the university sought out the renowned postmodern architect Michael Graves to design a renovation of the sociology building. And as that renovated and rededicated building, now called Carlos Hall, opened in March 1985, Dr. Poling mounted an inaugural exhibition on the architectural legacies of Michael Graves and Henry Hornbostel, the architect who had laid out the original Druid Hills campus and had designed Carlos Hall initially. The Atlanta media gave the museum great rave reviews. Atlanta Journal-Constitution art critic Catherine Fox recalled that the former hodgepodge of the museum at one time had included hair from the beard of King Edward IV. But she went on to praise the largest archaeological collection in the Southeast and the state's largest collection of Renaissance and Baroque drawings. She wrote that the positioning of the museum on the main quadrangle attested to Emory's increased commitment to the humanities. Just a few years later, in 1987, Dr. Poling announced that he wanted to return to teaching full-time. And so a search got underway for a full-time director of the museum. Emory found that person in a 31-year-old assistant curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Manhattan-bred, Ivy-educated, Maxwell Anderson arrived in Atlanta in the fall of 1987 with a truckload of ambition. Within months, he had laid out a packed agenda to build the scholarly reputation and the popular appeal of the museum through outreach to Atlanta and to the international museum world. The museum mounted a series of exhibitions through an innovative international loan project with museums like the Louvre and the Museo Nazionale Romano. Two more initiatives sought to build enthusiasm among Atlantans. The first was Veneralia. This was a gala celebrated under a huge tent on the quadrangle. It recounted the ancient festival of Venus, when Roman women asked the goddess of love for fulfilling sex lives. Live mannequins, spray painted to resemble marble statues, stood in various poses around the elaborately decorated banquet tent as Peter Duchin and his band entertained the guests. Emory's museum was moving up, and it was also moving out into the metropolitan area through educational programs designed to bring school children into the museum. And the spring of 1989 inaugurated BC Fest. The collections also continued to grow. The museum acquired two major collections of art of the ancient Americas, and Michael and Thalia Carlos began to develop the Carlos collection of ancient Greek art. And soon the museum once again needed more space, and once again, Michael Carlos stepped up. Just 6 years after the rededication of Carlos Hall, Carlos offered $3.5 million toward the construction of a whole new building that would more than quadruple the size of the museum. Breaking ground in November 1991, the museum moved into its new Michael Graves designed building in May of 1993. 2 years later, Anderson left for new challenges. But by the time he left, he had helped to guide the museum into the internet age and had expanded the museum staff to 22 full-time and 20 part-time professionals. After his departure, the wonderful Catherine Howard Smith, who's been on the museum staff for decades now, stepped in as interim director, and she guided the museum's participation in the Cultural Olympiad of 1996, when Atlanta hosted the Centennial Olympic Games. And in fact, there was an exhibition at the museum of Thornton Dial's art, and another exhibition in what was then called City Hall East, now called Ponce City Market, of self-taught African-American artists, an exhibition that was called Souls Grown Deep. And during this time, the university again looked for a museum director. And at last in 1997, Emory found that new director at the Bailey Art Museum at the University of Virginia. His name was Anthony Herschel, and he had earned a reputation for understanding what the Emory provost, Billy Fry, called the dual nature of a university museum as both an arm of the academic community and a public institution. When Tony arrived at Emory in the spring of 1997, he immediately began planning an exhibition of artwork about the Buddha. The aim was to have the exhibit up in time for commencement in 1998, when the Dalai Lama would be the keynote speaker. This exhibition included a rare copy of the Blue Beryl, borrowed from monks in Russia and shown for the first time in the West. The exhibition also occasioned the first sand mandala at Emory, a kind of performance art whose week-long construction of a beautiful mandala out of particles of sand has become an annual tradition during Emory Tibet Week. In 1999, the reputation of Emory for housing mummies gained renewed stature when an opportunity arose in Niagara Falls, Canada. The Niagara Falls Museum, which had opened, I'm sorry, I'm missing a picture that I had intended to show you here, of the old Niagara Falls Museum. It's also sometimes called the Daredevil Hall of Fame. But the Niagara Falls Museum had opened in the 1820s, a full decade before the founding of Emory College, but it was going out of business and selling off its collections, which in some ways resembled that old earlier Emory Museum. Stuffed animals and birds, a collection of eggs, a humpback whale skeleton, mastodon bones, and relics from Asia. The curator of Egyptian collections at the Carlos Museum at the time, a man named Peter Lacovara, called the director's attention to this Niagara Museum's 10 Egyptian mummies and scores of Egyptian artifacts, many of which had been brought from Egypt in the 1850s. They were now available at the fire sale price of $2 million. With only 7 days to raise the money, Emory turned to the Atlanta community for help. James Miller, who was chair of the Carlos Advisory Board at the time, and his wife put up half the funds, and donors ranging from school children to Emory staff members contributed another $750,000 to secure a commitment from the museum to sell all of the collection to Emory. And among the mummies that arrived on campus later that year was one that had lain in the Niagara Falls since 1860. The profile of this mummy resembled those of two other mummies resting in a museum in Cairo, Seti I and Ramses II. They were the son and grandson of Ramses I, whose mummy had gone missing. Could this mummy at the Carlos be the missing Ramses I? Off to Emory Hospital went the patient for CT scans, x-rays, and radiocarbon dating. Experts from Egypt arrived to view the body. And in the end, while the evidence proved somewhat inconclusive, the head of Egyptian antiquities, Dr. Zahi Hawass, pronounced that he felt certain that the museum had royal bones. Whether those were the bones of Ramses or not, it was impossible to say with 100% certainty. But in the end, Emory officials decided that after a period of lying in state in the Carlos Museum, the mummy would return to Egypt in 2003. Hawass said that children in Atlanta will learn that once upon a time, there was a king at the museum there. And before we started this talk, I heard one of you commenting that a few years ago or a year or so ago, before the pandemic set in, you were able to travel to Cairo and actually saw commentary on some of the placards about Emory and its contribution of this mummy and some of the artifacts back to the museum in Cairo. Well, by the time Ramses, or whoever he was, made his way back to the Middle East, Tony Herschel likewise had decamped to the Midwest in 2001 to become director of the Indianapolis Art Museum. In the fall of 2002, the new director of the Carlos, Bonnie Speed, arrived from Dallas, where she had been director of the Trammell and Margaret Crow Collection of Asian Art. She brought stellar marketing chops, a graduate degree in art history, and experience as a printmaker and designer and businesswoman. And that sort of brings us up to date. Before the pandemic hit, some 75 to 80,000 visitors a year were entering the portals of the museum, including 25,000 Atlanta school children and 6,000 Emory students. Curators and educators at the museum continue to collaborate with other departments, including, interestingly, environmental studies and chemistry, as well as the usual suspects. Exhibits and programs make the ancient world relevant to moderns, whether that means an exhibition of Romare Bearden's 20th century prints using Homer's Odyssey to reflect on the great migration of African Americans, or other exhibits of alumnus Fahamu Peku's contemporary art, which pulls from history and traditions in its own way. Just last week, the university announced that Bonnie Speed will retire at the end of this academic year, and a new position will be created, a new vice provost for libraries and museums, to help plan for the future of these areas, including advancement of the digitization and cataloging and conservation of the university's extraordinary collections, and continuing to enhance access for the Emory community and beyond. It seems clear that Emory is committed that over the next quarter century, the successors to the Candlers, Sheltons, Fatigs, and Bakers will continue to open new doors of discovery, and we can hope that the university and the public will reward those efforts with the resources and recognition they so richly deserve. So thank you again for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and return myself to TV. And I welcome questions. We can moderate those questions in a variety of ways. Maybe the best way would be through the chat box. If we have one question already in the chat box from Barbara. The question is, what happened to the collection of birds? As I mentioned, the birds were sent to a couple of places. Some of them went to the Fernbank Science Center, which is sort of right around the corner from Emory. This is not the Fernbank Museum of Natural History, which is a later construction from the 1990s, I think, or early 2000s. But the Fernbank Science Center was established near or across the street from Fernbank Elementary School, Druid Hills County High School. And that center became the home for many of those birds. Some of them also were sent to the University of Georgia. So other questions through the chat room, or if you want to unmute yourself and pose a question that way. Cynthia, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Yes, it's not a question. It's actually an invitation. I'm a docent at the Carlos, and it has just reopened, although it does require a registration so that we can limit the number of people who are in the museum at any one time. But on the 24th of March, Elizabeth Horner, who's been the director of education and is a wonderful presenter, is going to do a program for us, this same group of people, on the Wondrous World, which is just, it's a fabulous exhibit of Islamic art. So I hope people will come back for that. It's really just a beautiful, beautiful exhibit. And thank you very much, Gary, for your presentation. I didn't know, I mean, I'm a graduate of Emory, but I didn't know a lot of that. So it's very interesting. Thank you.
Well, and thank you for the notice about the museum being open for visitors. It's wonderful.
You register online.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a link in the newsletter that went out yesterday that talks a little bit about that exhibit, and there's a link to sign up if you want to do that.
Is Dr. Hawass still interested in retrieving artifacts from the British Museum?
I have not kept up personally with Dr. Hawass, but I dare say that that Egypt and Greece and many other countries whose ancient artifacts are in the British Museum continue to be interested in finding ways to bring those treasures back home. I'm not sure that Dr. Hawass is still in that position in Egypt. It's been a while since he was in that position, but at any rate, I think those conversations continue. I'm not up to speed on that particular facet of museum collection, but every now and then you read something in the news about those conversations.
Yes.
Other questions or comments? I know many of you have experienced the museum in a variety of ways over the years.
I have a question. I'm Jane.
I'm sorry?
I said I have a question.
Yes.
I was interested in the possible Ramses find, and my husband and I too went to Egypt. And when we were there, we saw this mummy at the Luxor Museum. And I was just wondering, the person, I wasn't on in time to hear the other person who said that they saw this in Cairo. So I was just curious about where this mummy is now.
I believe it is in Luxor. It initially, when it was returned in 2003, it was on exhibit for a time in Cairo at the museum there. And I believe there are a number of mummies at Cairo, but in time it was moved to Luxor, and that's, I think, where it still resides.
Thank you.
And there's a question in the chat box that says, and maybe Cynthia, you can answer this as a docent, what are considered some of the star pieces not to be missed when visiting the museum? You're muted.
Yeah, I know. I'm thinking there's so many things. Gosh, I don't really know how to answer that. Actually, there's so many things there. Certainly, the Egyptian collection is remarkable, but there are things we have. The largest collection is the ancient Americas, and it's just incredible and beautiful. And there are many things that are not to be missed. It's just not a one-trip museum, even though it's small, because there are 5 different areas that you can look at. So I don't know what I would say about what's not to miss. There are just so many things there that I love.
I would second what you say. I mean, I think the museum's reputation for being the mummy museum means that you definitely should not miss the Egyptian collection. And yet I find the artifacts from the early Americas, the pre-Columbian collection, really fascinating.
It's my favorite.
It gives us a kind of insight into a civilization that many of us know precious little about. We tend to be more aware of the Greek and Roman legacies and the Egyptian legacies, but the artwork and the artifacts from the ancient Americas are truly fascinating and instructive.
Yeah.
And then also, I would just say that usually the museum has a sort of rotating exhibit. Some of the galleries are dedicated to exhibits of drawings, prints, artwork on paper that are stored away and brought out from storage periodically for certain purposes. And those exhibits, and sometimes they're visiting exhibitions, those are always wonderful as well. I think before the pandemic, there was a great exhibition of prints by, I think the name was Thomas Huck. Is that correct? Huck, who drew his inspiration or draws his inspiration from the great engraver Albrecht Dürer and creates sort of contemporary, modern, very large engravings in the Dürer tradition. But those kinds of temporary exhibits are always fascinating as well.
So the one that's there now like that is Piranesi, and it's also a man who was influenced by Dürer and has huge but just incredible engravings that I would really, really recommend that you all see. It's only one room. I mean, that part of that exhibit is usually just one room, so it's very doable, but interesting.
And of course, this is Christine. Of course, to also visit the Asia Gallery. Renee Stein, about a year or so back, had a wonderful working lab exhibition, and she was working on the Jain tapestry, and that's hanging in there, as well as some other just wonderful pieces dealing with the Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain religions. Another wonderful area to visit at the museum.
Ginger Smith has commented again on Dr. Hawass that she said she believes he was removed from his major role with antiquities in Egypt during some recent period of unrest and violence, and now seems to be lecturing and promoting Egyptian tourism. So he's still active, but not in the same capacity that he was when he visited the Carlos.
Gary, I just want to say your presentation made me a little sad because when I was at Emory, my head was in a book so much I missed all this stuff, and I just really appreciate your sharing because now I'm going to make a point, especially after hearing Cynthia, to go to the museum and check it out after all these years. So thank you. You were great.
One thing that I didn't mention in the talk was that at a certain point, actually at a couple of points, there was talk about expanding the museum out of the Carlos, and eventually the current Michael Graves designed building was constructed. But there was some talk about whether the museum should be moved off campus. I mean, could it have been moved over to the Briarcliff property where the Buddy Candler Briarcliff mansion is located? There's a new, as you may know, there's a new library service center there that's state of the art, and perhaps a whole new museum could have been built there. There would have been more parking, easy access for school kids and the public, and so on. And there was a very deliberate decision, I think, that the museum needed to stay centrally located, much the way there was a very deliberate decision to keep the Rose Library and special collections very centrally located, so that Emory students could get to them without having to get on a bus or walk a mile and a half or figure out how to get to that distant Briarcliff campus. Not so distant maybe, but being able to walk out of your chemistry class and go across the quadrangle to the museum, where your chemistry professor may have assigned something for you to look at in the museum, is a wonderful blessing that I think many students take for granted, or as you say, don't even really know about.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, I would like to thank Gary on behalf of all of us. This has been really interesting. We've all learned a lot about the Carlos and its history, and thank you again. You did a great job, and we really appreciate it. Also, don't forget on the 24th, the Islam show at the Carlos, and that will be virtual, by the way. So thank you all very much, and we will see you in a couple of weeks, maybe.
Thanks again, all.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Gary.
Bye-bye.